Okay, this is question number 3 from the 2007. So this is 2007 AP exam. And this is question number 3. And it talks about some inverse functions. So if you go back to the notes page, you can find our notes on inverse functions. But what we need to remember here is the derivative of an inverse. So if we have g inverse of x, but I want the derivative of that, we get 1 over g prime of g inverse of x. So the derivative of the inverse is 1 over the derivative of the original evaluated at the inverse. So that's what we're working with here. Now part D says if g inverse, g to the negative 1, is the inverse of g, write an equation for the line tangent to the graph at x equal to 2. Okay, so to find any tangent line, remember we need the slope and we need a point. Well, let's find our slope. Well, the derivative is slope. So we need to find the inverse, the derivative of the inverse evaluated at 2. Okay, so that's what we're going to do here. Let me just slide this up a little bit. We can't go too far. I'm going to need this chart. So let's take this chart. Let's move it down here. Okay, so we want the derivative of the inverse evaluated at 2. Well, that is 1 over g prime g inverse of 2. All right, now what does the inverse mean? So we got to read this from the chart, but essentially, remember, we had, the idea here is that if I have some number here, and I apply g to that number, I'm going to get a number over on this side. Let's call it y. Then, if I do g inverse of y, I'll get back to x. So the idea here is something will give me 2. Something on this chart is going to end up at 2. And then I'm going to take g inverse of 2 and end up back where I started. So I'm looking at the chart and I see g of 2. I see a 2 right here with my g's. So if I put a 1 in, I get 2. If I put 1 in here, I get 2. So g inverse of 2 is 1. So this part right here is 1. So now we get g prime of 1. So that's the tough part here, is reading that chart. We want the inverse at 2, so we've ended up at 2. We want to go back to where we started. We ended up at 2 with g. What did we start with? We started with the 1, so that's what we have here. Now it's g prime of 1. So here's 1. We want g prime, so that is 5 now. So that becomes 5. That becomes 1 over 5. So that's my slope. So my slope, let's go back up to the top here. My slope is 1/5. What is the point? Well, the point is what we had here. We put in 2 and we got 1. That's the point that is on the inverse function. 2 and 1. When I put in 2, I got 1. That's the one that is on g inverse. So I have my slope and my point. Let's go ahead and find the equation. So my point slope formula, y minus y1 equals slope times x minus x1. And I have 1. There's my 1/5. And here's my 2. So that's what we have there. That is good enough. You can rearrange it if you want. We could go y equals 1/5 x. I've distributed this through. this becomes negative 2/5, but then I'm going to add a 5/5, so that becomes 3/5. So either one, just be careful. If you go and try to simplify and make a mistake, you may lose a mark in there if you don't do that properly. So go as far as you need, stop, send that off, and then move on. Okay, if you need to, go check out the derivative of an inverse notes.